There are two versions of the resurrection. One of them is in your Bible. The other one is older. They describe the same event. They agree on almost nothing. The version you know says one man died, was placed in a stone tomb, and 3 days later walked out in the same body. He spoke. He ate. His wounds were still visible. Thomas put a finger in the hole. The entire argument, the one that built the largest religion on earth, depends on the body being real. The older version says the dead don't come back. They change. They stop being human entirely. They become something luminous, something that operates in a category a human body can't enter. The flesh doesn't walk out of the tomb. The flesh gets used up, consumed from the inside like a cocoon that the finished thing no longer needs. And the trigger, the thing that sets the whole process in motion, isn't a death. It isn't a sacrifice, it's a throne. Someone sits down and the dead begin to change. Two versions, same language, same phrase, Son of Man, running through both. And the older one was removed from your Bible 16 centuries ago. I'm Jon Blackwell, this is the Black Mythora. I've been comparing these two accounts for 5 months, verse by verse, translation by translation, and the longer I sit with them, the less the church version looks like the original. It looks like the edict. But if you like to get your own personal readings, I've put it on my website, theblackstore.co. You put in your birthday and it tells you everything about your current life. Grab it before it gets sold out. We're limiting the number of copies to 300, only to keep exclusive for our buyers. The link is in the description, or scan this QR code. This channel pulls the texts they buried and reads them out loud. Subscribe if that matters to you. Every Christian denomination on earth teaches some version of the same event. Jesus of Nazareth was crucified under Pontius Pilate. He was buried. On the third day, the tomb was empty and he was standing in a garden. Bodily resurrection, physical and tangible. Paul says it in 1 Corinthians 15, if the dead are not raised, your faith is pointless. The body is the argument, the body is the proof. Without it, the whole thing unravels. But there's a text that was already in circulation when Paul wrote that letter. A text that uses the same phrase Paul uses, Son of Man, over and over again. A text that describes the resurrection of the dead with specifics. And the specifics don't line up. Here's what you need to understand about the Parables of Enoch before I show you where the gap is. Chapters 37 through 71 of 1st Enoch are called the Parables, sometimes the Similitudes. They're the most controversial section of the book, and the controversy comes down to one question. When were they written? 1st Enoch wasn't composed in one sitting, it's a composite. 5 sections, different authors, different centuries, stitched together over time. The astronomical book, chapters 72 through 82, is the oldest, probably 3rd century BC. The Watchers section, chapters 1 through 36, comes next. The parables are the section scholars argue about the most, because the dating controls everything. Dr. James Vanderkam at Notre Dame, one of the most respected Enoch scholars working today, argues the parables were composed in the 1st century BC, before Jesus or Paul, before any gospel was written down. His dating argument rests partly on what the text doesn't say. Every Jewish text written after 70 AD references the destruction of the Jerusalem temple. The Romans leveled it, and the event was so catastrophic that it shows up everywhere in the literature like a watermark you can't miss. The parables don't mention it. They don't allude to it. The absence is a timestamp. Vanderkam reads it as proof the parables were finished before the temple fell. Józef Milik, the Polish scholar who published the Cave for Qumran fragments in 1976, disagreed. He pushed the parables to the 3rd century AD. His main evidence, no fragments of the parables turned up at Qumran. Every other section of 1st Enoch appeared in the caves, the parables didn't. Milik took that absence as proof they didn't exist yet. Most scholars today side with Vanderkam. Gabriele Boccaccini at the University of Michigan, the organizer of the Enoch Seminar, which is the closest thing this field has to an annual conference, has written that the consensus has shifted toward a pre-Christian date. The parables existed before the Gospels were composed. Lawrence Stuckenbrook at LMU Munich has reinforced the argument from a different angle. The Aramaic loanwords embedded in the Ge'ez text point to a Semitic original that fits the linguistic window of the 1st century BC, not the 3rd century AD. The absence from Qumran still doesn't have a clean answer. 11 caves, over 900 documents, fragments from every other section of 1st Enoch, and nothing from the parables. Boccaccini has suggested the Qumran community may have rejected the parables specifically because of the Son of Man theology they contain. That's speculative, but it's a better explanation than Melik's, which requires you to believe the parables were composed centuries after the rest of the book, in a tradition that somehow perfectly matched the theological vocabulary of a text it was supposedly unrelated to, which means the resurrection they describe was on parchment before Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John picked up a pen. And nobody told you that. Tell me in the comments if you were ever taught that. I never was. Chapter 51 is the resurrection chapter. Here is what it says: the earth will give back what was entrusted to it. Sheol, the holding place of the dead, will return what it received. The elect one will sit on the throne of glory. And the righteous dead will rise. That sounds close to the version, you know, until you read what happens after they rise. R.H. Charles, whose 1906 translation remained the English standard for most of a century, translates the key phrase as "they shall be changed." Straightforward, sounds like resurrection. But George Nicholsburg, whose 2001 Hermeneia commentary is the most thorough academic treatment of one-man Enoch in the English language, spends 2 full pages on the Ge'ez word Charles rendered as changed. Ge'ez is the ancient Ethiopian liturgical language, and the complete version of 1 Enoch that survived intact is written in it. Nicholsburg argues the root form doesn't mean alteration, it means replacement. The thing that rises from Sheol is not the thing that went down. Something comes up, but it comes up as a different category of being. The original is gone. What stands in its place is something new. Chapter 62 extends it. The righteous will be clothed in garments of glory. Chapter 58 says they will exist in the light of the sun. Across multiple chapters, the language consistently points away from physical return and toward transformation into something luminous, something that doesn't operate in a body anymore. It reads like an upgrade that wipes the original hardware. The Gospels do the opposite. Luke 24 goes out of its way to establish physicality. Jesus says, "Touch me." A spirit doesn't have flesh and bones. He eats broiled fish in front of them. The whole scene is engineered to prove that the body is real, the body is back, the body is the point. 2 texts, same event. One says the dead come back in bodies. The other says the dead leave bodies behind entirely and become something else. The first difference is the scope. In the Gospels, resurrection happens to one person first. Jesus rises alone. The empty tomb is singular. The promise is that everyone else will follow later, but later. The sequence matters. Paul builds his entire theology on it. 1 Corinthians 15 again. Christ the first fruits, then those who belong to him at his coming. First him, then everyone else. The sequence is the argument. The parables don't have a sequence. Chapter 51 describes a simultaneous event. All the righteous dead at once, triggered by the elect one taking the throne. There is no preview, no trial run, no single demonstration before the full deployment. The mechanism fires once, and it fires for everyone in the same moment. The elect one himself doesn't rise. He was never dead. He arrives, takes the seat, and the taking of the seat is the event. Everyone else changes because he sat down. Remove the sequence and the gospel argument loses its load-bearing wall. Because the gospel argument is that one man went first to prove it was real. The parables say nobody went first. The parables say the trigger was an arrival, not a return. That distinction isn't cosmetic. It changes who the central figure is and what he does. In the Gospels, he suffers. In the parables, he governs. Two completely different job descriptions attached to the same title. The second difference is what happens to the body. I need to be careful with this one because the translation layer hides it if you're reading in English. The Ge'ez word that appears in chapter 51, the one Nikolsburg flags, shares a root with a term used elsewhere in Ethiopian liturgical writing to describe what happens to a caterpillar. I checked this twice because the first time I thought I was reading it wrong. The word doesn't describe a body waking up. It describes a body being consumed from the inside by the thing that replaces it. The flesh isn't restored, it's used up, like fuel, like a cocoon that gets eaten by the thing growing inside it. Charles left that nuance out entirely. Nib, working at Oxford in 1978, mentions the root form in a footnote, but doesn't follow it into the liturgical parallels. Nikolsburg comes closest, calling the transformation ontological rather than restorative. But even he doesn't use the caterpillar word. I found it in a lexicon entry cross-referenced against the Kebra Nagast, the Ethiopian text of royal lineage, the one that traces Solomon's line through the Queen of Sheba to the Aksumite kings. Same root, same meaning, different context entirely, but the word does the same thing in both places. It describes something that ceases to be what it was, as a necessary condition of becoming what it will be. I'm not saying the church deliberately hid this reading, but 3 major translators encountered this word, and none of them translated it in a way that would make a reader picture something consuming its own body from the inside. They all chose softer words. Changed. Transformed. The Ge'ez doesn't say renewed. The Ge'ez says replaced. And there's a difference between a body that comes back and a body that gets used up, so something else can stand where it was. The third difference is the mechanism, and this is the one I think about when I can't sleep. The church teaches that resurrection requires sacrifice. A death had to happen. Blood had to be shed, one life given for many. That's the engine of the whole system. Without the cross, there is no empty tomb. Without the death, there is no rising. The parables don't use death as the mechanism, they use enthronement. Chapter 51. The elect one sits on the throne of glory. That's the trigger, not a death, not a sacrifice, but a coronation. The dead rise because someone took the seat. The throne isn't described as furniture, it's described as operational. Something that activates when occupied, like a switch built into the architecture of the cosmos, waiting for the right person to sit in it. The sitting is what turns on the system that transforms the dead. There's a pattern in the parables that I don't think is accidental. The enthronement appears in chapter 51. It appears again in chapter 55, again in chapter 61, and again in 62. 4 separate passages, each one adding a detail to the same scene. The elect one on the throne, the dead rising, the kings and the powerful watching it happen and realizing too late which side of the system they're on. 4 passages, 4 slightly different angles on the same moment, each reinforcing the same mechanism. That's a writer documenting a single event from 4 positions, the way an engineer would document a process by walking around it. I spent 3 weeks charting those 4 passages against each other, made a grid, column for each chapter, row for each detail. The grid is on my desk right now, covered in coffee rings, 47 cells filled out of 64. The 13 empty ones are where the texts use different vocabulary for what I think is the same thing, and I can't tell yet whether it's a real difference or a translation artifact. Not relevant to what I'm about to say, but that grid is how I know the pattern holds. Think about what that means if the parables came first. It means the older version, the one in circulation before any gospel, didn't require anyone to die. The mechanism was power, enthronement, a seat being taken, and somebody between the composition of the parables and the composition of the gospels replaced enthronement with execution, switched the trigger from a coronation to a crucifixion. I don't know when it happened. I don't know if it was one person's decision or a slow drift across decades of oral tradition bending toward the version that made the better story. I've looked for the seam and I can't find it. I'm not saying Paul was reading the parables by candlelight in some back room. But the overlap between his language and this text is specific enough that scholars have been circling it for decades without landing. Here's the phrase that connects everything, and I need you to understand how it works before the next part makes sense. Son of Man. In Aramaic, the language Jesus spoke daily, the phrase is bar enasha. It can function as a cosmic title. It can also just mean a person, a human being, someone like me. The most ordinary self-reference imaginable. In the parables, it is not ordinary. The Son of Man is a named role, a figure who exists before the world, who is hidden until the appointed time, who takes a throne, and from that throne initiates the transformation of the dead and the judgment of the living. Chapter 48 says he was named before the sun and the stars were made. Chapter 46 describes him standing beside the head of days, a figure most scholars read as God, and having a face like one of the holy angels. Margaret Barker, who spent years at the University of Durham studying the temple theology behind early Christianity, argues this figure was already embedded in Jewish expectation before Jesus was born. The parables didn't invent the Son of Man. They recorded him. And the figure they recorded doesn't die. He arrives and sits and judges. There is no humiliation, no trial. He walks in already holding the authority that the gospel version only acquires through suffering. When Jesus uses the phrase over 80 times in the 4 Gospels, he's either inventing a title or claiming an identity that already had a job description, and the job description in the parables doesn't match the gospel narrative. The parables as Son of Man never bleeds. He never asks for the cup to pass. He never hangs from anything. He is power from the first moment he appears on the page. If you've ever noticed that Paul's resurrection theology doesn't perfectly match the gospel accounts, and scholars have generated entire libraries about that mismatch, the parables may be the piece that explains why. Paul sounds like he's describing transformation, not resuscitation. He sounds closer to Enoch than to Luke. Put it in the comments if you've read both and noticed the gap. I want to know how many of you caught it before this video. Now here's the part that ties the knot. Chapter 51 was in circulation before any gospel was composed. Vanderkam's dating is firm enough that most working scholars accept it. The Son of Man phrase was available. The resurrection framework was available. The transformation theology, the version where the dead don't come back in bodies but are replaced by something new, was available. All of it right there in a text that Jewish communities were reading and copying by hand for generations. Then it was removed, not reinterpreted, not absorbed, removed. The Council of Laodicea, 364 AD. The Book of Enoch was excluded from the Western canon, all 108 chapters. And it vanished from the Christian world everywhere except Ethiopia, where the church kept copying it as though nobody had sent the memo. For 1400 years, one version of the resurrection was taught. Physical, individual, sacrificial, a body in a tomb and a body walking out. The version from the parables, older, stranger, describing transformation instead of return, was gone. Unavailable. Sitting in a church in Aksum in a language nobody in Europe could read, while the other version was preached in every cathedral on the continent. James Bruce, a Scottish traveller who most historians describe as half explorer and half lunatic, brought 3 copies of the Ethiopian manuscripts back to Europe in 1773. One went to the Bodleian at Oxford, one went to the Royal Library in Paris. The third he kept. R.H. Charles published the first full English translation in 1906. 133 years between recovery and translation. And another century before the scholarly consensus on dating solidified enough to say, with confidence, that the parables came first. That's how long the blackout lasted, roughly 1500 years, where no one in the Western Christian world could compare the 2 accounts. And when the comparison became possible, when you could finally put chapter 51 next to Luke 24 and read them in the same afternoon, they describe two different events. Same phrase, same cosmic promise, different mechanics, different outcomes, different answers to the most basic question the resurrection raises. What happens to the body? Whoever wrote the parables, and we don't know his name, we don't know if he was one writer or several working across decades, in a tradition that valued the text more than the person holding the pen. He sat down and described what would happen when the dead came back, or what would happen when they stopped being dead and started being something else. He was specific about it. He didn't write a promise. He wrote a process, enthronement, activation, transformation. Bodies consumed by what grew inside them, and something luminous standing where the body used to be. He described it before the Gospels were written. He described it in a tradition that treated it as true and copied it by hand for 300 years. And then someone decided his version wasn't the one that would survive. The manuscript is still in Aksum. Chapter 51 is still in it. The word that means replacement, not return, is still there. In the same hand as everything around it, in a language that preserved what the West erased. Nobody changed it, nobody softened the word. It just waited. 14 centuries is a long time to wait for someone to read you accurately. But the text was patient, it usually is. Jon Blackwell, the text doesn't care whether you believe it.